Okay, it's 7. I'll put it on speaker view. 7 o'clock. It's time for our traditional Thursday meeting. And welcome everybody. And if you haven't done so yet, please introduce yourself in the chat box and tell us a little bit about yourself. What are you doing professionally? Where you're joining us from? And why you've decided to come to this particular session. And we are dealing today with an interesting topic of working with anger, dealing with anger in challenging times. And I'll tell you again, that's one of the topics which Paul Grantham particularly interested in. And I remember several years ago when he ran his course on anger and introduced some interesting thoughts of ideas of anger being seen as addiction and things like that. It was really groundbreaking. And I'm sure it will be a very interesting evening today. So I think it's enough of me, and I can pass the microphone to Paul. I just need to unmute him quickly. There you go, Paul. Take it away.
All right, thanks very much, Julia, and welcome, folks. Wow, what can I usefully offer you over the next 15 to 20 minutes on the whole issue of anger and working with people who might be angry, really. I felt that I wanted to say something about this because it seemed particularly appropriate at the moment that we are showing some degree of evidence of living through angry times. I mean, the most obvious sort of close to home manifestation of this is quite clearly over the current protests in connection with Black Lives Matter. But there's, again, if we're talking about sort of domestic or close to home expressions of anger, we have probably seen that quite substantially in a growing way over the last, I guess, something like 4 or 5 years. Certainly over the issue on this side of the Atlantic, over Brexit, both sides of the argument on that, and also across on the other side of the Atlantic as well. And I think more recently I've noticed that there has been, I guess, some degree of expression of anger towards the government's response in connection with COVID as well. So it's an issue that's around certainly at a social and political level. And although that's not directly what I wanted to sort of talk about today, I think it provides a backdrop. And not surprisingly, when you have a backdrop of a particularly strong emotion, it tends to show itself through the individuals that we might be working with in exactly the same way. I think particularly early on with COVID, we had more manifestation of anxiety problems, for example, with a backdrop of being anxious about what was occurring with the pandemic. So I just thought it would be quite a sort of good time really to offer out some thoughts on anger, specifically from a client perspective. Having said that, of course, one of the things that is, I guess, going to be on a lot of people's minds, particularly with regards to the current protests, is the whole question, and this may well come up in questions at the end of what I've got to say, about whether anger is always bad. And of course, the brief answer to this is, of course, it's not always bad, in exactly the same way that there's a lot of other emotions which are not intrinsically bad. I mean, being anxious is not an intrinsically bad emotion to have. It's a very appropriate emotion to have. And the same can actually be said about anger as well. So I guess that sort of raises the question of how is it, or what is it that defines anger as a problem? And I think there's two things that I would encourage you to sort of reflect on with this. One of them is relatively straightforward, and the other one is slightly more complex. At one level, and I think this is exactly the same with any type of emotional response, one of the ways in which we define something as a problem really is in terms of whether it interferes with our functioning or whether it interferes with the functioning of somebody else. So it's a purely functional definition. However, I think that anger has some other additional complexities to it. And I think that one of the complexities it has in relation to it is that it is a close bedfellow of a number of other emotions. Now, I'm going to say something about that in a broader sense in a minute. But what I'd like to just differentiate at this point in time is to differentiate, for example, between anger and things like hatred and resentment and revenge, which are, as I say, very close bedfellows. And I think that people often confuse in their own experience anger with these other things. And I thought it was a good point just to sort of illustrate this is with a quotation from Mandela, who was reflecting on when he was actually released from prison, saying that as I walked out the door towards the gate that would lead to my freedom, I knew that if I didn't leave my bitterness and hatred behind, I would still be in prison. And indeed, I think that when we're talking about feelings of revenge, resentment, hatred, I think almost invariably I'm probably more likely to see those as problematic. For the person themselves, I think there's a lovely quotation, which is that people often think that revenge is a feast until they realize they're the main course. And I think that obviously these particular feelings also have implications for other people. So what I just really wanted to start with there was to encourage you when you're working with clients to explore specifically really what feelings you're actually talking about, because there's a tendency to label all of these things as anger management problems or anger problems, and actually I think that there's some important differentiation that needs to be explored, and that sort of broadens out really to other emotions, and which makes anger, I think, particularly complex to deal with. I think that to my knowledge, the longest piece of writing, comprehensive piece of writing that's ever been done on anger was actually done by St. Thomas Aquinas during the Middle Ages. And he identified or described anger as being an impure emotion. Now, when he used that term, he didn't mean sinful. What he actually meant was that it's, if I can use a metaphor here, is it's a bit akin to primary and secondary colors. So anger often mixes itself in with and gets associated or confused with other emotions. So let me just run through a few obvious ones here. It is commonly strongly associated with anxiety. I've often said, I remember working with a colleague who, when you actually got to know her, you always knew that when she was particularly anxious, because she would come into an office and bite people's heads off. So she might manifest that as anger, but actually what she was primarily feeling was anxiety. We also know that, and I do wish to emphasize this point, although it is not universal, it is not uncommon for anger to also be associated with both loss and depression. It's also, in many instances, it comes about as a result of what is called goal blockage or frustration. In other words, it has a direct behavioral, or it's a direct behavioral effect. We also know, for example, that anger, and I think particularly because of its strong association with fight, in fight-flight, manifests itself very, very commonly indeed when people have low-level unmet needs. So to just to get you to cast your mind back to Maslow's hierarchy, you know, anyone that's ever had kids and has not slept very well that night will know that they will have a tendency to lose their temper or bite their head off or whatever. And the same for people if they're feeling hungry or whatever. So that's a physiological manifestation. So I hope you can see that this raises some interesting questions about the degree to which we directly address anger and the degree to which we see this as an expression of another type of problem which we might wish to address. Now that in itself, can I emphasize, is a very complex issue which I can't really get into this evening, and I'm going to sit on the fence on this by basically saying there are some instances where anger problems can be addressed by addressing the other emotion or the other problem, and there are some instances where the anger needs to be directly addressed itself. But all I really wanted to highlight here was the fact that you know, this is a very complex emotional state and has been recognized as being such really for centuries, I think. There's some other confusions that occur, because when people often talk about anger or anger problems, and can I say this is particularly the case if you look at statistics on anger problems, what you'll often find is these are not statistics about anger at all. They're actually statistics about violence in some particular way. So actually, anger gets confounded with violence. Violence problems are often seen as anger problems. And anger is often seen as the route into dealing with these. That is, again, briefly, that is of help on some occasions, but it's got some other problems attached to it. Not all violence is angry violence. Violence can occur for other reasons, and equally what I wish to emphasize very strongly is that being angry does not automatically lead to violent behavior. So, but the two are often confounded, really. And again, that sort of adds to the complexity. But there's one thing which I really want to, you know, if you want some specific takeaways from what I'm about to say or are saying this evening, which are, I think, of greatest sort of practical relevance, leaving aside this rather kaleidoscopic, multifaceted aspect of anger as an emotion, is the fact that it is extremely common indeed, either before or immediately after someone feels angry, to feel that they are responding to a perceived injustice. Now, please note my use of the word perceived here. It may be a real injustice, it might not be, it might be in the eye of the beholder, but it is all about a perceived injustice. And that creates a major problem. And it creates a major problem because it raises all sorts of motivational questions. You know, if basically I feel angry because I feel I have been treated unfairly, it is very understandable indeed for me to be thinking to myself, why the hell should I be the one that changes? You know, feeling angry here is quite understandable, and in a strange way, for some people, it gives a slightly nice warm feeling inside. That warm feeling that you get with a sense of self-righteousness, which obviously in many instances is often associated with feeling, and I'm not making a judgment here about the rightness of this, but the feeling and the belief of being a victim. So in that instance, people feel justified in feeling that way. Now, this, as I say, does create a motivational issue. And I think why I want to emphasize this point to you is that although it's not universal, I think one of the big mistakes that has historically been made with anger management approaches is to see the issue of anger as being a skills deficit problem, which has to be directly addressed. You know, it's seen in many ways as an arousal problem, and that somehow or other, if we can actually teach people to manage this, then they will be fine. The difficulty with it is, of course, is that a lot of people who are angry don't want to learn to be less angry. So there's a whole motivational issue here. So again, I'm not going to get into that now, because there's all sorts of ways in which you know, we can address that motivational question. All I want to say is I think that you need to explore what the attitude is of your client towards the fact that they're angry, and whether or not that they actually see their anger as justified, and what their attitude is towards the idea that they themselves are the one that is going to have to change. Now, one of the things that sort of leads into this, or is associated with it, and I think in some ways gives a, I guess I would say, a sort of a rough and ready guide to the whole question of what someone's attitude is towards anger, is whether they actually see their anger problem as what is called egosyntonic or egodystonic. So is this somebody who's saying to you, my problem with my anger, I really don't like it, I hate it, I want to get rid of it, it's not me, please help me? Or are we talking to somebody whose view of their anger is egosyntonic? They feel it's part of them. In fact, actually, these are often folks who feel potentially threatened by the idea of becoming less angry. I remember many years ago working with an ex-gang leader, and I say he hadn't been a gang leader for a couple of decades, but he had been in the background of that particular culture, and he had reached an age where he realized, I think fairly unusually, that he was going to have to try and do something about this long-standing anger that he actually had. But the difficulty was that he had a reputation within the subculture of which he was a part. And I remember quite distinctly him saying to me in something like about the first session, he said, let me just warn you now, whatever you're going to do to me, if you try and make me any softer, I'm going to leave. Because what he's actually saying there is, well, he was actually saying two things. He was actually saying, my identity is tied up with this, and I find that quite threatening. But he was also saying something else, which incidentally, I think for any of us that are not familiar with particularly violent subcultures, is that from his perspective, he was very concerned indeed, and I think probably genuinely concerned, about the threat to his own safety if others did not perceive him as being as angry as he had been. That somehow or other he was perceived as softer, and he was actually genuinely concerned about where his own physical safety lay with that. So this whole issue about attitude towards anger, I think, is worth looking at with clients, because in instances where people have a sense that they wish to own the anger, that it's part of them, that they feel it's justified, you are going to have to probably work fairly substantially on the whole motivational issue. We've got some evidence from other sources to indicate that, and I think this is particularly the case, incidentally, when you're looking at working with offenders. I know that probably only a small proportion of you are doing this, but it's worth, I think it shows itself in other contexts as well, which is that we know that for some individuals, who are taken through a purely skills training approach to anger is that basically they can use their anger to create a front. They can use their anger management skills training to actually to create a front that they're in control, which incidentally often enables them to engage in more sophisticated expressions of violence. So this whole question of attitude towards anger, I think, is pretty central. If that's not a problem, can I say, and incidentally, I think it's substantially less of a problem if you're working with children. I don't think, though, those sort of attitudinal issues, those motivational issues are so marked in children. I think that for that reason, for those of you that are working with children and younger people, where there's not a marked subculture in particular about this, I think it's much easier to go in with a skills training approach. We're not going to be talking about that today, but if you're thinking, well, what would that be? I would probably say whatever it is that you have already learnt or used in the anxiety management field, which is all about lowering arousal, is going to be equally applicable here as well in terms of working with anger. But it is going to be a much more complicated issue when individuals feel basically morally justified in feeling angry, or where alternatively the expression of anger is seen as normal in some particular way. So that's an issue for you, I think, to have a look at. There's also another important division, which I also want to emphasize, which really leads into two separate types of anger problem. Now, the division that I'm about to describe is a very categorical, it's a very rough and ready distinction, but there are some psychometric instruments around, like the Staxi, which for those of you that want to use a more formalized or standardized way of trying to assess this. But I think for those of you that aren't familiar with that sort of approach, there are ways of finding out what type of problem folks actually have, simply by exploring it with them and observing and understanding how the problem manifests itself. So this is what the broad distinction is. It's a distinction between what might be broadly termed anger expression problems and anger suppression problems. So let's take anger expression problems first of all, because they tend to be the ones which people tend to associate or see as being anger problems much more readily. They're also the ones, incidentally, which tend to lead to referrals, simply because they manifest themselves more readily, and they probably tend to interfere with other people's lives the most. So, you know, the criminal justice system comes across them very often, much more frequently. Schools are more concerned about them, and so on and so forth. So what are these? These are basically where individuals have a low threshold for both feeling angry and expressing it. A low threshold. This is where we have individuals, for example, who we would often describe as having a short fuse, where people feel that they have to walk around on eggshells, where anything sets them off. These are often people, incidentally, who one tends to experience as being close to the edge in some particular way. It feels like they could lose their temper very easily and very readily. And as I said, you know, these are clearly folks where I think the problem is much more visible. There is, however, another type of problem, which is equally common, but it probably doesn't get seen quite as frequently. And that's the problem of anger suppression. So this is basically about the non-expression of displeasure or disagreement, which we sort of associate, I think, very often with ideas of being unassertive or passive in some way. And that sort of problem with anger can manifest itself in a number of ways. I think obviously there are some instances where people become depressed as a result of anger suppression. But I just wish to make clear here, I'm not trying to suggest that all depression problems are related to anger suppression, but that simply it can manifest itself in that way. But the other thing that you might notice are certain individuals who maybe 95% of the time are very passive and then periodically appear to explode. They will often lose it. And it's often, I think it's often a surprise to people who know them. It's often described as being out of character. These, not surprisingly, are often people who will also describe their anger expression as being ego-dystonic. They'll say, I wasn't in my right mind when that actually happened. I distinctly remember working with a client. I've mentioned them on many occasions in training, of a client that I worked with who was slightly, rather socially awkward, looked sort of physically slightly unusual, and who was frequently bullied. He was somebody in his local community who was well known, but was always attempting to lean over backwards to be helpful to people. He had this very strong belief of always saying yes, I think substantially based on the need to be accepted. But the reason why I was asked to see him was that he had brought down a pint-pot mug on somebody's head in a pub and fractured their skull. And why had that happened? Because he was being teased by two guys across the bar. And like a lot of people who are bullied, he basically tried to laugh along with them initially. And that didn't work, and they continued, and then he went silent, and they continued, and then he just walked around and smashed the glass on top of this guy's head. Now, he was absolutely horrified by what he'd done. Those that knew him were staggered. He was absolutely convinced that he was crazy and mad. But what we actually had there was a very extreme form of an anger suppression problem. And what was interesting about working with this particular guy was that it took us quite a long period of time for him to even be able to notice when he disliked something. He felt guilty about even saying that he disliked something. He felt guilty about saying no to any suggestion. And he had been doing this for so long that he, in a sense, had lost sight of instances where he would feel negatively towards things. So actually, some of the initial work that we actually did was very basic work on emotional identification, which would allow folks to, or allow him rather, to be able to make that recognition of the times when he was angry. Now, not surprisingly, over and above that anger suppression, he also had very strong beliefs about that, which were ego-dystonic. So we also had a secondary issue which we had to address, which was addressing the beliefs that he actually had, that to express anger or even disagreement would be morally unacceptable. So we had a motivational issue there as well, which we had to address first of all. But I just really wanted to give that as an illustration, really, to demonstrate the fact that, you know, if you've got someone with an anger problem, there is really no point in teaching them, for example, how to relax. Because how to relax may or may not, incidentally, be helpful for someone with an expression problem. It's certainly not going to be helpful for somebody with a suppression problem. So it's important to be aware of what the nature of the problem is. Now, I'm aware of the fact that we're a bit pushed for time here, so I just really wanted to mention one final thing which you need to be aware of when you're dealing with anger problems. And that is about the whole issue of substance use. Because substance use has particular strong associations with anger, particularly when it gets expressed in terms of violence. Now, there are many instances, I can't get into the big debate about, do you treat someone's substance misuse problem first, or do you treat the anger first? I would certainly say that as far as alcohol is concerned, I think it's extremely unusual to not be able to do some, or it's not essential to do some successful work first of all with regards to alcohol management before you even get onto the anger problem, if basically the anger problem expresses itself almost exclusively when the person's intoxicated. You will need to do something on the substance side of it first of all. But I really wanted to finish on a much more positive note, which was to say there is one particular substance which is very strongly associated with a lot of anger problems, which actually is a fast-track route to treatment. And that's the association with acute and chronic caffeine consumption. So I'm not going to go into this in a lot of detail. All I really want to finish by saying is, do get people to self-monitor their caffeine consumption. And I can think of numerous cases I've worked with where getting the person to phase out caffeine was literally the only intervention that I was engaged with them, and it was more than sufficient to deal with the anger. So I'll leave you at that point, folks. I can see a number of questions have come up here, but we'll leave it at that point. And yeah, over to you, Julia.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you very much. Before we go to questions, I wanted to quickly share my screen with you, because I don't know if you, can you see my screen? Yeah?
Yeah, there we go.
Yep. Because Paul has a whole 2-day course on working with anger problems, where he goes into great depth about all the issues he mentioned today. And Paul asked me to create a 50% discount for people who attended this Zoom session, in case you wanted to know more on the subject. The course is available as full recording, and currently it is with 50% discount. You can get in the special offers on SDS page, and you can find it, or you can go direct through bit.ly /SDS Anger. It's easy to remember, SDS Anger, and you'll get to that course with a 50% discount. So please, if you're interested, do have a look. And now, Paul, if you can see the questions, do you want to choose questions yourself?
I can't say if you wish to choose them, far away. I don't mind what I.
Right. Well, I've copied a few questions just so we start from the beginning. And you more or less already answered. The first question was about people who are generally very calm, but then periodically demonstrate extreme anger. You've more or less touched on that. There's another question from Hannah. How can you work with the motivational issues and excavate these? Should you affirm that they developed current way of being for good reasons? How do you...
Sorry, that they've developed being angry for good reasons.
Yes, they've developed the current way of reacting to situations, being angry for good reasons. Should you affirm that in order to motivate them?
in brief, I'm going to start off with the assumption that if I'm seeing somebody, they are not currently happy with their status quo. They are either not happy with being angry, and it's creating some interference in their life, or they're just not happy seeing me. So they might not be unhappy with their anger, but they're unhappy with having to see me. And in both sorry, this is obviously with people who are mandated. And in both instances, what we are going to have to do is to spend time looking at the benefits of change. And there's two ways in which any of us get motivated to do something. One of them is to get away from something that we've currently got that we find unpleasant. And the other way is to get something that we would like to have that we currently don't have. Now, in many, many instances, as far as motivation is concerned, it tends to be the former which is in people's minds, at least initially. So, you know, we just need to find out from the person what it is about their current status quo which they would like to change and get rid of. So, you know, we can then get into a further discussion about whether the price they are paying for that anger is worth it. So I would actually bypass the whole question, really, of whose fault is it. I mean, that's going to lead us down a cul-de-sac. But I think, you know, what I want to concentrate on is whether the person themselves is happy with the status quo, and what it is about the status quo that they're not happy about.
Okay, thank you. There's an interesting question from Jenny. If the person has been rewarded by their anger, for example, people give in or things change in their favor, do we then manage them being less angry as the anger has enabled them to get what they want and then being assertive?
That's a really good question. Because one thing I didn't get a chance to touch on is, broadly speaking, not across the board, but broadly speaking, anger works. There's lots of instances where I would imagine many of us, when we go into a shop to complain, we might work ourselves up a little bit because basically we know we're likely to be more effective. If we were to go in there totally chilled, we might believe we're less effective. And I do think that that's an issue. So the whole thing comes back again to the price that the person's paying. But I think you're right. I think sometimes you need to have a discussion with the person about whether the price that they're currently paying for being angry justifies the benefits that they get from being angry. I hope that makes sense. It's because what I think is important here is to recognize and acknowledge the benefits that the person gets from being angry in the first place. But I think equally, it's important to acknowledge and to recognize that they're there seeing you. They're not happy if they're having to see you, whether they're sent or voluntary, they're not happy about being there. So for that particular reason, they're paying a price. And I think that exploring that cost-benefit analysis is very important. Yeah. But I think I can think of a number of clients I've worked with who have had to accept that by becoming less angry, they might become less influential. Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. There are some big long questions, and I'm a little reluctant because we have very little time. There's quite a few questions again about people who are suppressing their anger so effectively that they can't even recognize their emotions.
Okay.
You touched a little bit on that, but maybe you can.
Let me give out a few additional tips thoughts then on that. I think the first thing to recognize is the fact that the word anger is an extremely strong word. And I think that actually expecting people who suppress anger to own that word is probably rather overly optimistic. So I would want to start off with exploring with the person times when they felt a little irritated or mildly annoyed. And I think people can often buy into this initially more easily with that. And then once we've got some acknowledgement of that, we can then look at the whole question of the variability within that emotion. Because actually, things like annoyance and anger are in many ways very similar, but they're at different positions along the spectrum. So what we might do is we might spend some time looking at different words which might be used to describe different intensities of this particular feeling. And I'm more than happy to work with somebody who is able to change in a way which enables them to function more successfully, if that involves us using a language which never uses the word anger. So I've certainly worked with people with anger suppression problems where we have actually talked about therapy being helping you to be less annoyed, or to be annoyed in a way which doesn't create so many problems. So I think overall, a lot of this is actually a language problem. And if you alter the language you use, I think it provides a gateway for a lot of people with anger suppression problems to begin to start exploring it.
Thank you. Thank you. There are some very, very interesting questions coming up, and I have a feeling that we probably will need to have another session, probably just answering those questions, and have another session on working with different types of anger. And I genuinely invite people to watch the recording of the 2-day anger course. You can imagine how much more Paul will be able to cover and discuss in the 2-day course. And for now, it's unfortunately, that's it. And we are seeing you hopefully next Thursday. And we have an excellent presenter next Thursday, Chris Irons, Dr. Chris Irons, a specialist in compassion-focused therapy. And he offered us a very interesting topic, compassion-focused therapy inside out, about self-compassion and self-care for therapists in the difficult times. So it's next Thursday, the 18th, I think, of June at 7 o'clock here. And as always, we'll send you an email with the registration details so you can sign up for that course. Thank you very much, Paul. And thank you very much, all of you, for coming. And keep coming and keep safe, stay well, and see you again. Thank you. Thank you. Bye. Thank you very much. Good to see you all. Bye now.